slight technical issues will be started there. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. It's our great pleasure to be joined tonight by Dr. Andrea Marashi of the University of Bologna, who will be speaking to us on the subject of the magical uses of food in history. Dr. Marashi is a contract professor of the Department of Agro-Food Sciences and Technologies at the University of Bologna and a lecturer in the Anthropology of Food. Since July 2021, he's also been a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bari, conducting research on artificial gem production in Naples. Prior to that, he served as a lecturer in medieval history and later economic and social history of the Middle Ages at the University of Bari, and has also completed postdoctoral research at the University of Iceland at the Árni Magnússon Institution for Icelandic Studies, looking at food and magic in medieval Iceland, graphophagy, cannibalism, and sympathetic magic. He's also completed his PhD in 2013, writing a thesis entitled Eat, Drink, Love, Food and Food Rituals of Marriage in the Early Medieval West. His publications include A Banquet to Get Married, Marriage and Food Rituals in the Early Middle Ages, published in Spoleto in 2014, as well as Cannibalism, Graphophagy, and Sympathetic Magic in the Middle Ages, 500 to 1500, published in Spoleto in 2020. He's also producing an upcoming book entitled Food and Boundaries, Symbolic and Ritual Function of Food as Border from Augustine to William of Rubric, 400 to 1250 AD, and has also helped to edit two monographs, one in 2021, entitled Food in Medieval Scandinavia, with Victoria Giernicki, as well as an upcoming monograph in 2022, entitled Becoming a Witch, Women and Magic in Medieval Europe, circa 500 to 1400. He's also written a broad variety of articles from 2011 to 2022, on a variety of subjects such as the law of sympathy at play in late medieval and early modern Scandinavian magic and medieval practice, the history of medieval Scandinavia, magic miracles and rituals to fight famine in Old Norse literature, and rules for attending wedding banquets in early medieval Europe. And he's also been involved in a number of conferences and workshops covering topics as diverse as cannibalism in the Middle Ages, carnival in late medieval sermons, magic in the 4th and 5th century Christendom, and signs of fire in medieval skies. Dr. Marashi, thank you kindly for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, Peter, and hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for your very, very kind introduction. And I want to personally thanks, firstly, João Vegas, who got in touch with me a few months ago and was really eager to involve me in your beautiful food history network. International Food Studies Network, actually. So let me just try and share my slides so I can start my talk. Just let me know if everything's working.
All good on my end.
Okay, amazing. Okay, it works. Okay, so as Peter said, and as you may have understood, I am not really the conventional food historian because I like dealing with not really canonical stuff. I also like reading and writing about things like banqueting, eating together, but I'm mostly interested nowadays in other aspects which orbit around the table and alternative uses of food. And among such alternative uses of food, I really dig topics such as graphophagy. And so tonight's lecture is going to be about eating spells and prayers, which is a thing I find very, very intriguing. And this topic could be extended to the whole of the medieval West. But in fact, tonight I'm going to focus on medieval Scandinavia, so Norway, Denmark, and Iceland in particular, because I had a chance to spend a few years there in Reykjavik specifically, and I could consult a few interesting manuscripts, and I wanted to share my researches with you. So we're going to talk about examples of graphophagy, specifically in the medieval North. So please forgive me if I need to introduce this topic a little bit. I'm going to shift to food and beverages in a moment, but I first want you to really understand what this is all about. So you gotta know, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, that in the medieval West, two main principles guide magic, science, and even religion. And by the way, sorry, I will be often use these words one after each other, magic, religion, science, because I mean, maybe you know that anthropologists such as James Fraser, talked about them at length. But of course, Fraser had a positivistic approach, about them. So he thought that pretty much magic was the type of interpretation of reality that primitive people had. So it was a wrong interpretation of reality. So he had a very, very opinionated attitude. Then he thought that religion was a slightly improvement in the interpretation of reality and cosmogony, and then science was the final correct step that civilization had made. But of course, we don't share this attitude anymore, because we try to respect these steps much more than he did, of course. I mean, Fraser is still a great resource if we are interested in these sort of practices, but we don't really want to share his attitude. Anyways, if you know a little bit about Fraser, you're surely familiar with the idea of sympathetic magic. And sympathetic magic pretty much responds to the first law that you can see up in the screen. So, similia similibus curantur, like cures like, or more in general, like produces like. And this happens to be one of the most common and widespread and shared natural laws in the medieval West, but not only in the medieval West, actually as far back as you can go, in Rome, in Greece, you can find this law applied in many different domains of knowledge, medicine and magic, and even religion included. You can find examples of this law even in the Bible, even though when you see this law applied, it is often not overtly applied, okay? It's something like occult, even though it was widely shared. But you're mostly familiar, for sure, with the second law here. So contraria contraris curantur, which is the opposite kind of law. And it is a kind of principle that was applied by the two major cornerstones of scientific thought in the West. So Hippocrates and Galen, because, and I'm sure you're more than familiar with this, but both the humoral theory and the temperament theory by Hippocrates and Galen, respectively, are based on the idea that, we've got 4 bodily humors within our bodies, and we are healthy when these humors are in perfect balancement. But then when 1 or 2 of them maybe is overabundant, we need to counterbalance that abundance by means of a specific diet. And of course, since these humors are described by couples of qualities like dry, hot, wet, and moist, you need to eat and drink things that counterbalance that. So contraria contraris curantur. Okay, so these are the 2 main laws that we find applied in magic, in religion, in magic and science mostly. But the first one, similia similibus curantur, we also find it in some religious contexts, as I will show you later. But the point is that we cannot really, neatly separate magic, religion, and science in the medieval West, and even less so in the medieval North, for reasons that I will try to explain to you in a moment. But I just want to, give an example. When we talk about medieval Scandinavia, Iceland, for example, we are talking about, marginal lands. These lands, turned to Christianity around 1000 AD, some countries later, some countries earlier. But even when they turned to Christianity, even when they converted to Christianity, they did so, not neatly, not from one day to the other, and everybody turned Christian. No, it was like more a progressive passage, a transition, right? And this happened in Europe as well, but more so in these marginal lands. So as we shall see, medicine and even magic in these marginal lands combined powers from religion, from Christian religion, and from non-Christian supernatural domains, so to speak. I know it seems a bit confusing, but I will try to, clarify your minds later. So, the first law, I'm mostly interested in the first law, so like produces like. So like produces like is based on the law of sympathy, which is very banal, actually. And it is a very basic kind of reasoning by analogy, okay? It's very banal. And it comes from the idea of sympathy. Sympathy is a Greek word, okay, which comes from the root soon, the prefix soon, sorry, which means with, together, and the word pathos, feeling, suffering. So sympathy means feeling together, suffering together, okay? The Latins would translate it as compassio, but the meaning is the same. So as I said, this is the kind of law that we find in many, many different practices, but the most elegant and precise definition of it comes from philosophy, actually, comes from the Stoics, and then later from Neoplatonic philosophers. And we can consider it the kind of theory of everything of the medieval West. It is a natural law by definition, okay? I want to give you just a quick example of what it is about. So the founder of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, compared the universe to an actual giant musical instrument, okay? This is going to be useful to understand how graphophagy works, so bear with me. So Plotinus says that the universe is just like a giant, almost infinite living being, where everything is connected with each other by links of sympathy and antipathy, okay? And he says that when you pray, or when you utter a charm, or when you write a formula, and here I read the second passage, the prayer or the charm or whatever you're uttering or writing is answered by the mere fact that part and other part are wrote to one tone like a musical string, which plucked at one end vibrates at the other also. So this means that if you're interested in magic and in medicine, he would have called it natural magic or natural philosophy. You pretty much can obtain whatever you want if you know your notes, and then if you know your chords, then you're able to compose a song. Okay, this is the metaphor. And when you know the right notes and the right chords, so you are able to exploit these links of sympathy and antipathy in the cosmos, you can pretty much sort every issue out. You can cure any sort of disease. You can have success in love, etc., etc., etc. You're going to be the wisest of all men. This is serious stuff. This is not just occult science. This is serious stuff. So when you pluck one of these frets in this giant living being, which is the universe, this note, this frequency reverberates and travels through space, through the fabric of space, through a thing that he called pneuma, which is a sort of fiery, vital breath. It's like air, but it's vital air, okay? So this is how the universe worked according to these great philosophers. So just to summarize it up, so sympathy is nothing else than a principle guiding action at a distance before gravity, okay? You can obtain whatever you want, even at close distance or at very, very, very long distances, even at the other side of the universe. Sympathy takes place among things or events that are alike or are opposite to each other. So like produces like, or of course, if there are links of antipathy, you obtain the opposite effect. The causes of sympathy are invisible to the naked eye, so you can't see these vibrations, but they are there. So you got to know them and you can exploit them. And then finally, the effects of sympathy can be like instantaneous. So that's how it works. And now let's see how we can apply this to cases of graphophagy. So let's take the example that pretty much summarizes the case studies I will present to you later. So sympathy works on two levels. And Fraser talked about this, even though, as I said, he interpreted these things as like an inferior way that primitive people had of like explaining reality. So we can't really rely on his explanation, but the content of what he was saying was pretty much right. So there are two levels of sympathy. The first level is homeopathic. Okay, so like, as I said, produces like. So an effect resembles its cause. And the second level is the contagious level. Things that have been in contact with each other continue to act on each other, even at a distance. So how does this translate into graphophagy? So let's say you want to cure a disease. So you can actually write a formula like a prayer, like a paternoster, okay, which in your culture, we assume that that can have a positive effect on something else. You know, in the Gospels, Christ works many healing miracles. So the paternoster in the culture of a Christian individual can have that effect. You write that on parchment, and then you may want to scratch off the letters from the parchment, and you may want to mix them in a chalice with water, with wine, or other drinks. You mix them and you drink them. And so you are, you know, exploiting the two levels of sympathy. You are producing a like from a like. So you take a paternoster and you want to obtain a positive cure, so a positive effect. And of course, you exploit the contagious level of that, because you're going to take the surface, you're going to scratch off the letters, and you're going to absorb those powers. You're going to actually digest them. So that's how you exploit sympathy. And again, I'm trying to make this very complicated. It's very simple, but this is the rationale. This is the actual philosophical explanation of it. So how does this, how do we really find this in medieval Scandinavia? Yes, we do. But it's not easy, because this is a sort of, you know, weird knowledge. These sort of examples of graphophilia are not really widespread in Scandinavian manuscripts of magic and medicine. I was able to spot just a few examples, but they're very interesting nonetheless. So an example of this ancient knowledge comes from Old Norse mythology, actually. Not really of Old Norse mythology, but Old Norse poems, okay? From a lay, which is called the Lay of Sigurdrifa, Sigurdrifumal, one of the ancient lays which are included in the Elder Edda. So for those of you who don't remember this, Old Norse mythology, you know, all that we know about Old Norse mythology, well, we take it from two main sources, aside from the sagas, of course. And these are the Elder Edda and the Prose Edda, which was written by Snorri Sturluson. Now, the Elder Edda, which is the older one, is preserved in a manuscript which is called Codex Regius and dates from 1270 or 1280. And you got to bear in mind that these lays actually were transmitted orally for maybe centuries, okay, before they were finally written down on parchment by Christian hands. But they, of course, reflect a pre-Christian culture, Old Norse culture. And here in Sigurdrifumal, we see a Valkyria, Sigurdrifa or Brynhildr. They are probably the same figure. Brynhildr, who teaches the hero Sigurdur, the famous dragon slayer Sigurdur, who we also find in Volsunga saga, for example, the saga of the Volsungs, which is very famous. So we find her teaching Sigurdur runic magic. And by the way, we don't really know whether runes were used for magic purposes. There are no clear proofs about this. Some scholars think they were used in magic. Some others are not very convinced with that. But anyways, here we find, you know, Brynhildr teaching Sigurdur how to use runes for magic purposes, okay? And what do you have to do in order to exploit runes for magic purposes? You have to carve them on wood, and then you have to scratch them off that surface, and you have to mix those fragments with helga mjöd, which means sacred mead. Now, we don't know why this mead is sacred and how you make it sacred. But we know that, for example, mead is one of the, you know, more prestigious beverages in that culture. We know that, for example, in Valhall, mead is probably the second, you know, most preferred drink, because we gotta make an exception with wine. Wine is definitely the most prestigious drink and is, you know, reserved to Odin only. Odin lives on wine and on wine only. But the Einherjar, the warriors of Valhall, actually really like and enjoy mead even more than ale. So we know at least that mead is one of the most important, markers of identity in that culture, even though we don't know why here this meat is Helga, is secret. So this is how it works. But let's actually check out whether this was practiced or not. By the way, I forgot to mention that Brynhildr teaches Sigurdur to use runes for many different purposes, all of them being magical. And so you could use runes, for example, to win on the battlefield, or as the lay reads, not to be beguiled by another's wife that you trust, or you could use them to help a woman bearing a child. So you got to bear in mind that one of the reasons which one of the reasons why magic and religion and science were not so far apart from each other in the past is that their purposes were the same, because it doesn't really matter what you believed in. Your issues, your everyday issues were the same. So different systems of beliefs, but same issues. So purposes of miracles performed by saints, purposes of magical charms, purposes of medicinal remedies often coincide with each other, often, overlap. So you have runes for, childbirth, you have runes for many different reasons, and you have other medical remedies or magical recipes for the very same purposes, as we shall see. So let's take the first manuscript, which is very interesting. So this is preserved in Copenhagen, at the Arni Magnusson Institute in Copenhagen. This is a medical treatise in all regards, okay? So this is about medicine, and we know that, among other things, because it is based on two cornerstones of medical thought in the medieval West. The first one is the Salernitan Medical School, Schola Medica Salernitana, okay? And the second one is the famous Danish physician Henrik Arpestreng, who, by the way, was called the Danish Salernitan, because himself was, deeply drew upon the teachings of the Schola Medica Salernitana. So this manuscript, this medical treatise, relies on two cornerstones of medical thought in the West. And we know that it was produced in a cloister of Santa Clara in Roskilde, west of Copenhagen. So in it, we find a very, very interesting example of graphophagi, indeed. It is a remedy ad solutionem ventris, which means to loosen the bowels, okay, for constipation, as it were, okay? And it suggests to write the following formula on an apple or a loaf, and then to give it to the patient to eat, of course. And the formula is currens discurrit cursor, conservat utrumque famus Dei. And by the way, when I say these formulas out loud, I always fear I'm gonna evoke a demon, because you never really know what's gonna happen. Anyways, now formulas of such a kind are really tricky, because most of the times we don't understand what they mean. And most of the time they mean nothing to us, but we can still spot a few references to things that we know, or that we are familiar with at least. So the first thing here is famulus Dei. Famulus Dei is an expression that you often find in hagiographies, and it means servant of God, okay? So it is a way to call saints, because saints are often described as servants of God. They are often called famulus Dei. Indeed. So here we understand that the practitioner, who is a physician, is kind of calling for powers from the Christian supernatural. For some reason, he's doing that. He's trying to integrating powers from the Christian supernatural into his medical recipe, okay? But now let's take a look at the first part of the sentence, currens discurrit cursor, which is a strange form of Latin, which doesn't really mean anything, but is actually very interesting in sympathetic terms, because this is how sympathy works. Currens discurrit cursor is just like an invitation. is a reiterated way to say run, flow smoothly outside of the body. That's the idea, because it is directed to the, guests of your body, okay, of your intestines. So it is a sort of remedy which combines a formula which is based on sympathy and some kind of reference to the Christian supernatural. And this is medicine. This is not magic, okay? So this is the first example of graphophagy. And by the way, we don't know why they suggest to use an apple or a loaf. There's no specific meaning here. I believe that this is just because it is, two kinds of food on which it is quite, easy to write on, I guess, because they are kind of hard. So it's easy to carve letters on them. Other examples, as we shall see, have more specific, give us more specific ideas as to why they chose those foods. So these are the manuscripts. Is even more interesting. This is Royal Irish Academy 23D43, and this is so important because this comes from Iceland, by the way. It dates from the late 1400s, and it's a fundamental manuscript because it consists of basically most of the Scandinavian medical knowledge of its time. So it is a manuscript about medicine. It is a proper encyclopedic work of medicine and represents most of what was known at the time about medicine in Scandinavia and in Iceland specifically. Okay, it is written in Norse, and we know that it was commissioned by a secular leader, so it was not intended for monastic use. And look at the contents. It's a very, interesting manuscript because it features a collection of charms or kind of charms for medicinal purposes, and then a passage on the depth of the sea, a book of symbols based on the works of Erik Harpestreng, again, an antidotarium, a lapidary, a proper lich book, and even a cookbook, actually, the famous Northern Libellus de Arte Coquinaria. So, very interesting contents and very reliable work or collection of works, should I say. So whatever we find in it, should have been quite well known and respectable. And in it, we find this curious formula, which I'm going to translate for you, but it's very simple because most of it is just gibberish, pretty much. So theta her got vidridu, which means this is good for fever. Fever, as you probably know, is one of the most commonly addressed issues or diseases in these sort of works because, fever, you can, suffer from fever for many, many different reasons. So it's definitely one of the things you want to address in a medical collection like this one. So you gotta write the following formula on an apple or a leek. And the formula is Hasis eo strema, neo salvator Emmanuel, as imas agios, fremao salvator bao fao fao. And then we also have an alternative formulas, again, for fever, alpha or the palda cucho bogalava. And we know nothing about this. Again, scholars call this sort of language magical gibberish, which means that it doesn't make sense to us, but it probably did to the practitioner in question. Okay. But aside from mysterious words here, we can definitely single out a few words which are references again to a sort of Jewish Christian supernatural. So the word agios, for example, saint, Salvator, savior, Emmanuel, of course, etc. So again, we find this practitioner combining powers from different systems of beliefs, from different domains of knowledge. But in this case, we also note that the foods on which you should carve these words are, again, an apple and a leek. Loki is the kind of word which doesn't necessarily mean leek. It could also mean onion or any other plant of that, of that type. But it could be leek, and in that case, it would be very interesting because leek was associated with fertility in the medieval north, and was also referred to in runic inscriptions, in many runic inscriptions. And we find it spelled, as you see below, Laukur or Laukar, spelled in that way. And it was possibly used for magical purposes. As I said, we don't really know, but we know that this plant recurs very, very often in runic inscriptions. So this might be a reference to that, or it might not be. There's no way to know anything more about this. This other remedy from the same manuscript is even more intriguing to me. It is a remedy vid naftreira, which means for nosebleed. And this is an even clearer example of how graphophagy works and how it combines powers from different supernaturals, okay, so to speak. So in this case, let's say your nose is bleeding, so you are supposed to write a biblical verse with your blood on your forehead. And the verse in question is John 19:30, which is not a random verse if you read it. The verse reads, "When he received a drink, Jesus said, 'It is finished.' With that, he bowed his head and gave up his spirit." And of course, it is the verse where Jesus, who is on the cross, is given to drink that bit of vinegar. Okay, and after drinking it, he pretty much passes out. So take a look at how sympathy works here. So when he received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." And in this case, after writing this formula on your forehead with your blood, you got to wash that blood from your forehead, and then you got to mix the water and your blood in a chalice together, and you got to drink it. And then at the point, your blood is gonna stop flowing from your nose. Exactly what we read in the verse. When he received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." So sympathy works in this way. Again, there is a naturance, there is a formula, and it acts at a distance, okay, by contact. So we see sympathy working, on those two levels that we singled out earlier. So again, Christian powers, Christian supernatural, and a sort of practice which we could easily define as magical. But there's no reason to use these words because these are anachronistic words for these times. This is not magic. This is some kind of everything. Okay, this is probably what physicians or some physicians thought was medicine at the time. And this is very sensible if you read works from ancient intellectuals like, for example, Pliny the Elder or others, because according to them, in the past, mankind invented medicine first because men wanted to live better, to increase the quality of their lives. Of course, they wanted to sort everyday issues and to cure more common or less common diseases. But then at some point they realized that the powers of medicine were not enough. So they needed something else to integrate those powers because you could not cure all diseases with medicine only. And that's when they invented magic. So magic drew upon a supernatural. So magic had powers which medicine did not have. And so why use medicine only when you can use magic and medicine together? And that's exactly what happens here. The problem was that magic became an occult knowledge because Pliny says at some point magicians, had their souls corrupted because the powers of magic were so strong, were so powerful. Sorry for repetition, that they started dealing with occult stuff. But the birth of magic is very, very noble, and here we see it applied together with what we may call medicine. And let me conclude with a couple of examples from another manuscript, which is also preserved in Copenhagen, but was produced in Iceland. And this is very similar to our previous manuscript, to Royal Irish Academy 23 D43, but it's more leaning on the magical side of things. So it's similar to that. It features pretty much a compendium of knowledge, of most knowledge about medicine and magic at the time, but it's more about magic than medicine, okay? But curiously, we know that we're not sure whether this was for a secular leader or not. This might have been produced for monastic use, for that matter. We don't know. Anyways, it features, as you can see, prayers and charms mixed together in both Norse and Latin. It features proper medical works such as health prognosis and even a regimen, a leech book again, a book of simples, so all the sort of works that you would associate with medicine. But let's take a look at the charms. One of them, unfortunately, we don't really know what this recipe is about and is for, because this is how the manuscript starts. So we are missing the first initial part of this remedy. So when we start reading, we read that we need to write the following words on 5 oblatum, which means on 5 sacramental wafers, and you have to give them each of them for 5 consecutive days each morning to the patient. So one of them every morning for 5 consecutive mornings to the patient, even though we don't know what was the disease in question here. So on the first sacramental wafer, you should carve the word bion. On the second wafer, the word carrion. On the third, agrion. On the fourth, sagirion. And on the fifth, and ducas. Again, words which do not really mean anything to us. But what's interesting here is that this remedy actually sounds like a medical remedy, because even in medicine, even nowadays, you have medicines which you have to administer for 5 days, once a day, okay, like that. So this is the kind of thinking which underlies here. But still, these words are anything but medical. They are probably magical. We don't know, but they have to be written on a Christian liturgical element, the sacramental wafer. So magic, religion, and science all together at their best. But again, we don't know anything more about this. But let's take a look at one last example, and then I'm finished, from the same manuscript, because in my opinion, this is an even more fascinating example of sympathetic medicine or magic. This is a remedy, very simple remedy against lekni, which means mental derangement. And in this case, you have to write these words on probably just as many loaves of bread, not sacramental wafers, just simple loaves of bread. But take a look at the words: sans, gante, gantes, gantissim, gantissimus, which do not mean anything, but look at them. They are not chosen randomly. Look at their structure. They get longer and longer and longer until they end up with a word which sounds like a superlative adjective. And in my opinion, knowing a bit about sympathetic magic and how these remedies work, this was a way to like pull the mental derangement off your body, like to chase it away, like to thrust it out of your body, because the words are getting longer and longer. So sans, gante, gantes, gantissim, gantissimus, to enhance the effect of the remedy. Okay, each day the word would get longer. But this is just speculation. This is what I think about it, but we don't have any proof or any other source, at least to my knowledge, that can, substantiate what I think about this. But I believe that all these examples together, like tell the same story, so that at least in late medieval Scandinavian countries like Norway, Denmark, Iceland, but also Sweden, because I also studied manuscripts from Sweden, examples of graphophagy are quite rare, but pretty much all of them are based on the law of sympathy, which can be exploited in many different ways, but pretty much follow the same logic. So I hope that you enjoyed this unconventional talk about food history, And thanks a lot for being here.
Amazing. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Marashi. It's a really fascinating topic. It's not one which I've at all been familiar with ever since sort of started studying food history. So that's been a really fascinating deep dive. Thank you. And I'm glad to report that no demons have sprung up here either. So I think we're good in terms of the chance. To begin the questions, I'd like to invite Carlos to begin.
Well, Professor, thank you. Just gotta say that you got me hooked, completely hooked. You talked about the sympathy law. Is the sympathy law somehow related to what we call today the law of attraction, or it's a completely different subject?
You mean what they say, what they tell today about the law of attraction, which is very popular on the internet as well?
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, this is exactly the same question that a student asked me like a couple of days ago. Actually, the principle is very similar. And I believe that those who like spread these ideas about the law of attraction read a little bit of Fraser. And the reason why it is so popular, and it's actually incredibly popular on the internet. I saw books published which talk about the law of attraction. There are many, many videos with millions of views about this, because on the one hand, it is very simple. As I said, it is very banal. On the other hand, it doesn't really require a lot. It just requires you to think what you want. Think about what you want. You're just going to obtain it. Of course, the difference here is that the law of attraction nowadays is presented as something that everybody can exploit just by thinking. So you just need to concentrate. You just maybe got to do a little bit of meditation, or actually quite a lot of meditation. You got to really believe that you can do whatever you think you're able to do, because the universe is gonna give you whatever you want, because the universe is like an infinite source of power. So you just got to know what you want, and you're gonna get there and gonna obtain what you want. But there's a fundamental difference with the law of sympathy as it was intended in the past, because it was actually deemed quite hard to grasp. And I'm not saying that common people didn't know about it, because we have examples of circulation of these principles even among illiterate people, even among soldiers. For example, in these days I'm writing an article about crusaders and Muslim soldiers during the Crusades applying or seeming to applying the laws of sympathy in very basic ways, like, I want to absorb that soldier's courage, I'm gonna eat his heart. Okay, but this is a very basic application. Yeah, that happens, Peter. I saw your eyes like, yeah, we got sources about that. But intellectuals in the past thought that it was a very complicated thing. In fact, there are grimoires or handbooks of natural magic, one of the most famous of which is Picatrix, which was composed in Al-Andalus in around the half of the 10th century, and then circulated a lot, even at the court of the Christian king Alfonso X. So in both Muslim and Christian environments, which is a book on these sort of magics. So it is a book where they explain to you that the universe is composed of a macrocosm and a microcosmos where everything is connected all together, so you can obtain what you want, as in the law of attraction. But not everyone can do that, because in order to do that, in order to become the wisest of all philosophers, of all men, you gotta study astrology, you gotta study lots of different disciplines that can like introduce you to that sort of highest form of knowledge. So it is not something that everyone can do. Why the law of attraction they try to sell to us nowadays seems like a more democratic kind of knowledge, so to speak, which is reassuring, of course, because the author of these handbooks say that you gotta be really prepared for that. you know, you gotta be really, you know, committed to that. Well, the law of attraction is for everybody. So just buy this book and you're gonna obtain whatever you want. So it's something for our times.
Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, the principles are quite similar. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just as a quick follow-up to that, I really must ask a bit more about this whole heart-eating business, because wherever I expected that example to go, I did not imagine like crusaders or sort of Muslim soldiers kind of eating the hearts of people, kind of being something like that. I was just sort of curious. I would imagine, sort of with my limited knowledge of this, that was perhaps quite a taboo thing on the surface. Like, do you get any impression that there was some unease about doing this, or did people just do it as, you know, just expecting it to be a form of sympathetic magic like any other?
Well, first of all, thanks for your question. Very, very good one. First of all, we gotta take into consideration that chroniclers who write these historical sources about the Crusades, for example, they tend to be quite biased. So it really depends on who is writing that text and who the agent is. So we find Christians describing Muslim soldiers performing cannibalism of that kind, like eating other soldiers' hearts, and that has a negative meaning. But we also find Christians describing Christians crusaders eating human body parts, not necessarily hearts, but other human body parts like gallbladders or galls, you know, and they said for medicinal purposes. So apparently, as far as I could understand, people, and I cannot really quantify how many, but people seem to have believed that even human body parts could be used for magical medicinal purposes, and that they could be a way to apply this very basic law of sympathy. So I'm sure, almost sure, that these soldiers who were just common people were not aware of these higher, you know, and more refined applications of sympathetic magic, like, as I said, which we find expressed in handbooks like the Picatrix. But it seems quite apparent that they knew that, you know, there was this ancient idea, very ancient actually. Pliny already mentions it, but I'm sure it is even more ancient than that, that the most distinctive quality of an individual resided in their heart. So if you're particularly courageous, if you're particularly strong, particularly healthy, if I want to absorb that characteristic of yours, I want to eat your heart. That's where it's located. And on the part of Christian chroniclers, it seems something that only Muslims believed in. And when they describe Muslims doing that, so eviscerating their dead enemies to, you know, get their hands on their hearts, they describe it as a like barbaric, superstitious practice, like things that only Muslims can believe in because they are other than us. But then that's quite fun because, again, Christian chroniclers describe, you know, Christian soldiers cannibalizing their enemies as well. And in that case, they say, well, they do that for medicinal purposes. So, you know, it's about being biased, and none of these authors really wanted to be true to what they were seeing. But aside from biases, we see both Christian and Muslim chroniclers describing these practices about both Christian and Muslim soldiers. So the conclusion may be that both of these cultures at some level knew about these remedies, knew about this law of sympathy, and applied it in, you know, various ways, even a little bit gruesome ways, to be honest. And by the way, sorry, but I forgot to mention that why human body parts? Because one of the most fundamental principles in this kind of knowledge is that if the universe is a like a giant living being, and the stars and planets and galaxies are one thing with stones and trees and human bodies, you gotta also bear in mind that God, whoever he was, Allah or the Christian God, created man as a representation in scale of the universe itself. So all the notes that you might want to find, all the chords, the most beautiful chords that you might want to use for your songs, you're going to find them in the human body. So that's how you want to, that's why you want to, you know, cut your dead enemies and cook them in some ways.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense in a way, especially if you sort of imagine that there's a sort of almost a kind of slither of the divine going through everything. But of course, I mean, well, I suppose I should have known better than to, you know, take a crusading source at face value. But it is very interesting that there's that sort of idea of kind of that essence running through everything. And I suppose as a quick follow-up question to that, I suppose that also plays out in the Eucharist and like Christian Mass, where sort of, you know, the communion wafer and the wine is transfigured into the body and the blood of Christ. And what are we right in saying that we could describe that as a form of graphophagy, but in a more kind of religious sense, in the way that you're sort of absorbing the divinity of Christ by kind of taking in his body and blood through that ritual?
Yeah, in that case, I wouldn't really call it graphophagy, because even though there's there's actually a monogram on the sacred wafer, sacramental wafer itself, but in that case, you know, we might call it rather a case of theanthropophagy, like eating a man who is a god at the same time. Okay, which is very curious because aside from these cases I mentioned, cannibalism have long been rhetorically used by many different civilizations to describe the most dreadful of their enemies. So the enemies which I respect the least and which I fear the most, I'm going to describe them as cannibals, no matter what. This has happened to the Jews, happened to Christians, happened to pagans, happened to communists, and to witches. So the most other of all others is always a cannibal, because cannibal is the deepest and most deep-rooted taboo of Western civilizations, and not all the Western civilizations. But curiously, the core of Christian liturgy is actually an act of a kind of cannibalism. So they, at some point, you know, the peculiarity of Christianity, and one of the reasons why it became so popular so rapidly, is that they proposed this idea that God, you know, turned into a man to be close to his followers, of course, and then they try to successfully to turn cannibalism into the best thing that a Christian can experience. So it's very curious, very controversial, but that's how it works, because it allows the faithful to have a very, very close experience with God himself. So the problem with this, by the way, is that we've got sources like medieval exempla, which were stories that priests would tell to the faithful during Mass, where they teach the faithful, so common people going to Mass, listening to these sermons, not to misuse the Eucharistic bread. Because the problem with that is that on the one side, you have the advantage of partaking of God himself. But on the other hand, well, you got God himself on the palm of your hand or even in your mouth. And so apparently there were people who, for different purposes, because they were deceived by the devil, they said, they decided not to swallow the body of Christ. They took it home and they did all sorts of magical things with this, because it was still the Corpus Christi. So they used it for magical purposes as well. And then all sorts of demonic things would happen. You know, these examples are very crude and gruesome, very graphic. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah, definitely. It's yeah. That's that's really fascinating. I think, especially as you said, there's this sort of bizarre dichotomy between cannibalism, but also the sacred act of the Eucharist, which is the kind of central tenet of the Christian faith. It's fascinating how that kind of plays out, absolutely, and how that could always be misused.
Yeah.
following on though, we now have a question from Nuno, if you'd like to ask that.
Hello, I have a question related with the art eating history, but in another perspective. Does this idea can come from Egypt, where we know that they had some rituals which implied food and dead and well, and my question is, does this idea can come from Egypt? Because the Egyptian belief, it was then when a person died, his heart was going to wait against the feather.
Yep.
And if the feather was heavier, then the heart was pure. Can it come from here, this ideology of pureness of heart?
It may very well do, for a very simple reason. First of all, what you say about this beautiful belief in Egypt implies that there is some sort of connection with our heart and our moral integrity or our moral virtues, okay, which seems to be quite ancient. So there's no clear, there's no source to my knowledge which actually say and states, okay, we drew this upon Egypt. But at the same time, we know for a fact that what the sources call magic, and I'm gonna contextualize this word in a moment. Anyways, whatever magic it was, came from the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia first, and then Egypt. Persia, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. The people, the intellectuals, even in Roman times, who wanted to know more about this occult knowledge, went to Egypt and Persia, like Apuleius, for example, went to Egypt and was accused of performing sympathetic magic. By the way, that's a very fascinating story. I encourage you to read about the composition of Apuleius de Magia, or otherwise called Apologia. So I need to contextualize what magic is, though. Magic is like a word which actually does not really signify magic, what we mean for magic. Magic is the way that ancient civilizations used to define the religion of the other. Again, cannibalism is a rhetorical way to define the other. Magic is a similar rhetoric tool to define the other's religion, okay? So for example, the biblical magi, those who follow the Bethlehem star to go and find Christ, they are called magi because in that culture, Persian culture, Magus was a member of the priestly class. So they were priests. They were experts in divination, in rituals concerning the dead. They were priests in all regards. But then they were called magicians from their enemies, their opposing cultures. So what we call magic is actually religious knowledge, and that very ancient religious knowledge come from Egypt and Persia and Mesopotamia. So to answer your question, it would not be surprising if these beliefs, according to which the distinctive quality of an individual resided in one's heart, came from or was inspired from this ancient ritual and belief in Egypt, because that bulk of knowledge came from the Middle East. So I can definitely see a connection. That's a very, very interesting idea, and I didn't even think about it now, to be honest, because I was a bit fearful to make this sort of connection.
I have another connection, but I'm afraid it's absolutely bonkers. Honestly, because when I think when the professor talked about art, the art eating and the powers of the art, I realized the ideology of ancient Egypt and the rituals that the tribes of Latin America did. For example, when the food was low, they would sacrifice people, and principally they would cut their chest, and rip the heart out. So they had some kind of idea that the heart had some kind of magical power between the society and the gods, because the sacrifice was purely for the gods' amusement.
Okay, so the offering itself was the heart.
Exactly.
Okay.
The heart and the blood.
Yeah, which makes sense. Again, I would not try to, draw a link between South America and the medieval West, of course, but this is an interesting way to suggest that, as I said, this law of sympathy can be considered a sort of human universal. So I had the chance to talk with some scholars about this, and some of them were quite disappointing because they were like, oh yeah, but this is so banal. Of course, this is just reasoning by analogy. All primitive peoples, tended to think like this. Yeah, but they base their civilizations or many important rituals in their civilizations according to this way of thinking. So it might be banal, but as you showed, it is common ground which was shared between many different civilizations. And yeah, it's not surprising that people in the past associated an individual with his own heart, because heart is the most important organ, which gives us life. So yeah, again, it's banal, but still very fascinating. So yeah, anthropologists would definitely call this sort of human universal, this idea of associating the heart with the individual himself or herself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good stuff. I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. More's the pity to it. I think I speak for all of us when I say it's been a really fascinating discussion. And so I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Marashi. It's been a fantastic evening. And yeah, I think we've all really thoroughly enjoyed the subject. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody watching as well. We hope that you'll join us for the next episode. Thank you and have a good evening.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot for inviting me. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.